Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Sonika Garcia,
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast series focused on debunking the myths about behavioral science and arming our listeners with the information they need to make sense of behavioral science and to help them apply it to their work as marketers. So welcome back, everyone. Today, we are lucky enough to have our second special guest. Today, we have Andrew Gardner, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for Havas Links, which is our agency out in Manchester. Brad and I and the medical anthropology team have been lucky to work with Andy on quite a few projects, and the collaboration with Andy and his team has been wonderful. I mean, he is so smart, and you'll get to hear from him, not just overall strategy, but really what it takes to know our audience on a deeper level. A lot of what we talk about on this podcast is understanding our audience on a human level and having the right approach to really understanding them and getting those true insights to help understand why they make the decisions that they do. So Andy, thanks so much for being here.
Hello, thanks for having me along.
So, and I just want to make sure he's not just the head of Havas Links, he's the head of strategy for Havas Links Group, which is sort of a fairly large number of organizations out on the other side of the pond. And Andrew and I got to know each other through pandemic. We worked on something called Behind the Mask, which was a study looking at how doctors were handling things in the US and globally. And it was through those discussions with Andrew that I really got a perspective on how different things can be over in the European sphere of communications. So one of the things I wanted to ask Andrew about and that we really wanted to focus on is, we're the only country, the United States and New Zealand are the only countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer advertising for healthcare products that are prescribed. And that leads to some very interesting discussions with co-promotes and things like that, where what do you do in America versus what you do in, the European Union and England. But it also just underlines a very different approach to medicine, to communicating about products. So Andrew, what is like the significant difference in your opinion about advertising to consumers, meaning people who might take these products, versus doctors, people who are going to prescribe these products? And why is it, so important that we have that distinction?
It's an interesting question, and I think it sort of goes back to the heart of any purchase decision that's going on, where knowledge, experience, and skill completely dictate sort of how well you make that decision and how those evolve over time. And you've got a very big power imbalance in European markets and anywhere outside of the US, where the level of knowledge that someone has before they are unfortunately sort of set upon with a disease that they've not come across before, unless it's been something they've seen in a family member, it's everything's new. Whereas to the doctor, it's like everything's very standard, and I've seen, the patient's experiencing it for the first time. And so at a European level, you're kind of reliant on Dr. Google, whereas sort of in America, at least you've got these wonderful TV spots which are persuading you that it's perfectly fine to have this condition or that condition as you walk sort of happily through the park. So I think that probably shapes things quite a bit.
It does, and that was the basis upon which the FDA initially approved direct-to-consumer advertising, that you could use the greatest sort of broadcast medium ever invented to educate millions of people all at once, 30 seconds at a time, about healthcare conditions. Educate was the part that they, I think, believed would happen more than sell. But the big debate is now is, are we educating people or are we just selling them things? But to your point, it's different selling something to somebody who's a professional and is going to use this as a tool versus somebody who's an end user and is going to take this as a product. So talk about that a little bit. I know there's a gap in knowledge, but there's also a gap in your role in the use of this product.
Yeah, I was just sort of thinking about the fact that regardless of how sophisticated Dr. Google sort of makes us feel, all patients by definition sort of start off with a naive understanding of what's ahead of them. Whereas that person on the other side of the prescription pad, through their knowledge and experience, are probably overstating their own confidence in knowing what that patient is going to want or need in that moment in time. So it's I think where you have to observe it is how does that balance of power shift over time as you kind of experience a long-term condition, and how are patients over time making better judgments of what they really value in terms of outcomes and what they're prepared to put up with to achieve them. There was some interesting research that looked at what you were prepared to do to put up with as with an incurable cancer. And so people who were asked who'd never had this cancer before, they wanted all the heroics, and they were willing to put up with like rounds and rounds of chemo. But when they asked the same questions to senior oncologists, they basically said, put a blanket over me and leave. They've seen what it's like to go through the actual treatments themselves and don't necessarily see it. I think over time, as treatments have got better, I think if you did that conversation now and it was a curable cancer, something that you could have CAR T for, like that dynamic shifts. So it's always evolving, it's always changing and I think it's up to us to understand where people are up to with that dynamic, understand where the different interventions are going to make a difference or not, where the doctor's feeling in desperate need of being able to give some good news to someone but can't. And those are the things that you're kind of looking out for, because doctors by definition need to sort of be there with some answers for you and sort of have the confidence to say, oh well, yes, I can definitely help you out, whilst knowing at the same time, but not that much, or I wish I could do more, or the secret emotions that they're sort of hanging on to.
You brought up emotions, and that was actually my next question. So you talked a lot about, the needs. So like figuring out what the need of the doctor is. And when we do patient marketing, it's something similar. But a lot of what we focus on with consumer marketing is that emotion, and like what emotion do we want to elicit, or what emotion do we want to reinforce when it comes to the patient. But for doctors, same thing. We try to take an emotional approach as well. But that's a struggle sometimes, because what are the emotions that doctors are feeling? Is there an emotional component to HCP marketing?
Well, firstly, I'm kind of a real strong believer in the emotional nature of every decision that we take, but I think at heart we there's room for us to be much more sophisticated as an industry. And it's something that as strategists we talk about a lot. And the mistake you hear is when we're sort of thinking about emotions and communications, because you hear this sort of request for an idea to be more emotional. Can we have a more emotional idea? And the sort of the ham-fisted version of that is to create communications that sort of demonstrate the anguish that the patient's feeling in that moment to gain doctor sympathy. It's like, hey, look at how awful your job is all day, every day, looking at these people, and in some way expecting that to resonate with a professional who's been kind of trained to not engage in that sort of thing, because it's not their job to feel in the clinic. It's their job to guide people in an unemotional way through that. And so when they're making prescribing decisions, that's not what they're about. We also know that communications that include both rational and emotional messages and forms of messaging perform much better than those with either one alone. So we've got to get it right. And for me, it's about trying to find the way in which an emotion, because if you think about emotion is in the instant, the feeling is the echo of that, and then mood is what you're trying to sort of engage with people over the long term. It's a message wrapped with an emotion becomes an actual learning experience that someone takes with them, and it's so much more potent than just explaining something. The phrase I like to use is you can't rationalize someone into loving you.
I use the same one, but I use the verb lawyer. You can't lawyer someone into loving you. Like well, but if you look at Exhibit A, I'm perfect for you. It's like, and yet I don't love you. But you touched on something that I is sort of a pet peeve of mine, actually. So that's part of the reason why we did this podcast, so I could vent my spleen about things that make me crazy. And one of them is the idea that we get asked as planners a lot to sort of up the emotional quotient. And one time I wrote in a brief that doctors are cautious about change for certain types of very fragile patients. And the next time I saw the brief, a copywriter had changed it to terrified. And like that, yes, that is a higher order of emotion. It's also completely false because, to your point, no doctor who chooses, let's say, cardiology is terrified that their patients would die. They wouldn't have chosen cardiology if they couldn't handle their patients dying. They would have chosen pediatrics or something like that. Like by the time you become a fully trained cardiologist, you are used to your patients with heart failure dying. You are not terrified of it, And I think there's this desire to project the emotions that we believe patients are feeling, and we fairly certain patients are feeling, onto the doctors at the simultaneous time. And that's just not true. I've been a hospital interpreter, and you can't possibly feel the anguish that a parent feels every time you diagnose a child with cancer, or you'd literally jump off a roof in a week. It's just too hard. So, I think it's the part that I find really interesting, and I'd love your take on, is like finding the true emotions that professionals who deal with these difficult things every single day do feel. It's not like they're machines, to your point, they have emotions, but they don't feel the same emotions that their patients do. They couldn't.
There are things that doctors do enjoy, and that sort of that part where to celebrate the successes becomes quite an underarm pass, as we underarm bowl kind of thing, use cricket terminology, but because it's like the joy that a dermatologist feels when they recognize that someone's skin's cleared up and that they've managed to achieve something visible which has it's going to have a lasting impact on that patient's life. But they don't see what happens to the patient as they go out the door. It's that instantaneous, hey, I did a good job, I'll pat myself on the back. That's a kind of an easy one. The harder ones are like, what's the emotion that you go through? When we talk about emotions in decision making, what you're really talking about is bypassing decision making. It's what is the right feeling in that moment. So it becomes natural to make this decision over that decision. That's what influences behavior, prescribing behavior. And it's how do you become, what are the shortcuts, what are the heuristics that we can elicit so that we're getting to what we need to be. We don't need to get them to go on an emotional roller coaster like they're watching a movie. We need them to emotionally feel that the product we're talking about is right in that moment of prescribing. And that's the job. It's not to try and entertain people, unless entertaining them gets you to the point where it feels right, feels natural in that moment. So I think that those are the bits that you're looking for, and it takes time. It takes a great deal of effort, and one piece of research or one piece of quant is not going to give you the answer there. It's speaking to a variety of different people, learning what are the things that were completely odd to that doctor, and what are the things that are useful and sort of are tropes that work across all of the doctors, and also kind of trying things out. So you test something and you look at the puzzle on their face, and then you try something else and you realize that, oh yeah, we're kind of onto something here, and then build that over time and work out what that is, and then try and guide it through the creative process so that it doesn't get rinsed back to what a creative director feels the emotion should be in that situation. Oh well, actually the real story here is how patients feel about ... No, it's clinging on to the truth and the insight that you picked up at the beginning.
I think this title, the title of this episode will be "Clinging to the Truth."
Like
desperately, I just see a bunch of
Rose
planners trying to get on a raft,
Titanic.
like at the end of the Titanic. Exactly, we're just clinging to the truth. There's no room for you, Jack. There's just truth.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to think of a creative director called Jack, but yeah, as he
Anyway,
sinks to the bottom.
yeah,
No,
we
let's
let him
cut that
drown.
bit.
No, we didn't. We love our creative directors, but it is interesting, this idea that emotion must be strongly felt to be influential to decision making isn't necessarily true, or at least, it doesn't have to go up the scale of intensity of emotions. Like quiet satisfaction can be a very strong emotion. At the end of I'm a teacher, I'm not a doctor, but at the end of a semester where I feel like I've done a good job and 32 students have learned what I wanted them to learn, something like that, I don't go out and spike the football, but I feel good about it. Like you've executed my job as a professional. I imagine it's not totally dissimilar to how you feel after a good pitch as a planner. Like I executed my job as a professional, like that to me, and I guess it's a question in the form of a statement. That to me, when I think of emotions for professionals, it's how do I create that sense of satisfaction in a job well done, as opposed to this guy wants to jump over the roof with joy. Like occasionally we get products we launch that are utterly transformative like that, but for the most part, they're just better than the last thing, which was pretty good.
But equally, they're transformative, and but that transformation only happens once. I'm always thinking, once you've
Right.
explained that joy, what do you do the next day? Because you can't go through that twice. But we do need to build a relationship with these people. We do need to get them to remember the brand. Otherwise, all they're looking for is, okay, well, it was a 50% improvement today. If I can get a 51% improvement with something else tomorrow, then suddenly I've jumped ship again. So that's not long lasting just on the utility of the product alone. And it's got to be something which connects with people on a much deeper level, something which they like you as for the 50% you give, not just they like the 50%, because
I
that's
think some
always
of that,
productive.
but I think some of that also, yes, and I think some of that comes from recognition, genuine recognition of their actual feelings, as opposed to your imagined version of their feelings, where they're doing a jig in the hallway and then they go to their next patient. Like there's just too much going on.
Yeah, I think to that point, it's like what you're saying, Brad, assuming what the emotion is for doctors. And then a big thing, and going back to what you said before, Andy, is that thinking the patient emotion and the doctor emotion, there's this strong tie-in, and doctors should feel or influenced by the way that their patients are feeling as strongly as we think that they are. I don't think that's always the case. So I think that's an important call out. This
I
is
think
great.
the other thing I was just going to add to that
Yeah.
was I think it becomes a difficult one at a client level, because we can have a nice friendly agency conversation about emotions, and then they've got to go to their boss and go,
Right.
I like this communication because it's really emotional, or it's got a real emotional power to it. And the boss
Right.
goes, what in the hell are you talking about? And they can't back it up. And so I think and then it's like, okay, well, we need to find this emotional connection in research. And then it
Mm-hmm.
suddenly becomes very wishy-washy in terms of what you're looking for, and it gets rinsed out. But I
Well,
think
and
if you
I'm
break,
on
and if it's
record.
like, oh, don't talk to me about this emotional garbage. But I think if you break it down into, we look at from an effectiveness standpoint, communications in terms of, well, are we creating an emotional connection? And a product manager scoffs, and you go, okay, well, let's talk about emotional valence. Do you feel negative? Can we ask them if they feel negative or positive about it? And you're like,
Right.
okay, I'm happy with
Yep.
that. Can we talk about emotional dimension? What does the brand or ad make you feel? And then think about emotional intensity. So how emotionally involved are you with the brand? Oh, well, I can definitely answer all those questions, or ask those questions, and I'd be happy to get the response. It's like, right, we've now got a framework to work out whether this communication is working at an emotional level. And
Right.
it's like, okay, well, there's some objectivity now to it. It doesn't feel so wishy-washy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an important thing to get to as well.
Yeah, it is a great framework, and we'll have to have you back on because I wanted to hear more about this idea that emotions lead to moods, right? But that'll probably have to be for another day. That's an interesting one. So, any last thoughts from your side of things, aside from the fact that advertising to patients you find slightly odd? which we've had a discussion many times about. But any last thoughts on, emotion, doctors, advertising?
Well, I think I'd be remiss not to mention the recent work that we've done from our white paper perspective called Healing the Healers. And it builds a lot on the work we've done, Brad, from Behind the Mask, where one of the issues that we've got, we talk about, let's make a happy emotion about the treatment. But in reality, all of the emotions that are going on in the healthcare system at the moment are like rampantly upset about most things.
Super stressed, and every possible form of stress.
We talk about burnout, and we're hearing from HCPs about moral injury as being the level of discussion that's happening in that space. So you've kind of also got to think about how do you enter a conversation when people are striking, when people are feeling at their lowest ebb. We're getting there are 3 doctors a week at the moment in the UK committing suicide. I mean, it's absolutely like so distressing to watch. And how do we enter into that conversation with advertising to do the jobs that we've got to do, but do it in a way that's sympathetic to the audience that you're talking to?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one I'd love to do another episode on, but to your point, I mean, the data are clear. This is one of the most stressful occupations there is. It's also one of the most joyless now. And if you want to talk about strong emotions in this country, what's evoking strong emotions is things like private equity buying practices and then forcing doctors to work harder and emptying, siphoning off the profit to the private equity group. That is something you can get doctors to talk passionately about for much longer than you can to get them to talk passionately about the newest monoclonal antibody for urticaria or something like that. Like the real emotions that are being felt in the healthcare space around day-to-day working practices are frustration, are disappointment, are sometimes rage. It's really an interesting sort of cocktail, but it's fairly negative. And to your point, I think something that Andrew and I have discussed many times, and this might be a good note to end on, is part of our job is to make the doctors understand we're on their side, not just that we're trying to put a pen in their hand and like, just write the name of this drug here, but actually that like they do feel short of allies. And we should really be positioning ourselves to be someone that they can trust and who is listening to them, not just trying to use them as a script machine to our benefit. And I think that's something we should keep in mind as we put these ads together, that, their doctors are quite smart people. They're very good at reading situations and advertising and stuff. And they know when we're trying to use them as a tool, like, we're your best friend, write this. I think there's a genuine partnership that they appreciate when we do it right.
And what's our role as communicators to populate doctor culture to make things just feel that little bit better?
Yeah.
What can we do to help?
Well, if you're a doctor listening, both Andrew and I and Sanika think you're doing a great job, and we want to thank you for taking care of all of us, especially because we're usually at our worst when you see us. So thank you for that. And for Breaking the Code, I'm Brad Davidson.
And I'm Sanika Garcia. Thanks so much, Andrew, for joining and for that insight. That was awesome.
Pleasure.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Breaking the Code is a podcast by Havas Health and U's Medical Anthropology Department. Created and produced by Brad Davidson and Sanika Garcia. Content editing done by Catherine Rossi. Post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration by all of you. Thanks for listening and your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a rating and subscribe. Until next time.